The Varathi flagship drifted sideways, its cannons cold, and nothing fired back. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Debris turned slow circles where the Eternal's forward battery used to be, scorched plating, a severed antenna array, a scattering of hull fragments that caught the starlight and threw it back in broken pieces. 72 holes hung dark across the black, engines dead, weapons dark, drifting the way driftwood drifts on a tide with nowhere left to carry it. Not one had exploded. That was the wrong detail. A battle this size should have ended in fire. This one ended in silence, and silence was worse. High Priestess Thessakel lowered her recording device and did not press the symbol worn smooth by her thumb. She had been recording this war for 427 days. She had recorded the sound of ships dying, the particular pitch a hull makes in the half-second before its air gives out, the prayers refugees whispered when they thought no one could hear. She had never recorded a fleet simply stopping, 11 minutes and 47 seconds. That was how long it had taken one ship, one small, unmarked gray hull that swallowed light instead of throwing it back, to make 83 warships go quiet, not destroyed, stopped. Thessakel's hands were shaking, and she did not know if it was fear or something closer to awe. Her thumb hovered over the worn symbol on her recorder and did not press down. She looked at the human ship. It sat motionless now, a few thousand meters off the Eternal's flank, weapons dark, engines idling at a fraction of what she'd watched them do minutes ago. It had not fired at Admiral Zarvok's command deck. The shot had come close enough to scorch the hull paint along the observation ring, and then it had gone wide, on purpose, past the one place a kill shot belonged. She understood, in that frozen second, that the miss meant more than any hit could have. The message was not violence, it was control, and control, she was beginning to understand, could be the most frightening thing a person ever witnessed. Around her, on what remained of the last Archives bridge, nobody moved either. Commander Thalvok stood with one hand braced against a cracked console, staring at the tactical display like it might still be lying to him. His crew, the 6 who were left standing, watched him instead of the screen, waiting for him to tell them what had just happened, and he had nothing to give them yet. Only the number, 1147, I'll be honest. What she saw in that silence was only the beginning of what she'd have to explain. 11 minutes earlier, none of this had felt possible. Commander Thalvok had been counting down the seconds on his own shield integrity, and the number had not been good. 14 minutes, the display said when the first railgun round hit. Then it said less. Then the display cracked down the middle and stopped telling him anything at all. 2,300 civilians sat packed into cargo holds built for grain and machine parts, not people. His bridge on the last Archive smelled of burnt insulation and cold sweat, and beneath both of those, faint and constant, the mineral tang of recycled air that had been breathed too many times by too many people crammed into too small a hull. And 11 Iraqi ships, all that remained of a fleet that had once numbered 30, held a line against 83 Varathi warships that did not intend to let a single one of them leave this stretch of dark. Send it again, Thalvok said. His voice cracked on the second word. He caught it, steadied his jaw, and did not let it crack a second time. He had learned, over the last 3 years of retreat, that his crew watched his voice more closely than they watched the tactical display. If his voice held, they held. His communications officer, a thin Iraqi named Farron with ink-black eyes and hands that never quite stopped moving, keyed the broadcast a fourth time. Any council vessel, any allied fleet, this is the last Archive. We are the last defense of 2,300 civilians. We are outnumbered 83 to 11. We require immediate assistance. He said it the way a person says a thing they have already stopped believing will work, but says anyway, because stopping felt like giving up before the enemy had even finished the job. Static answered. Then, faint under the static, something that might have been laughter. Thalvok thought of the vote. 387 representatives had chosen not to intervene when the Varathi first crossed into Iraqi space, 4 years ago, back when the fleet had still numbered enough ships to make a fight of it. 12 had voted to send help. Only those 12, he'd been told once by an aide who'd since died in the retreat from the Second World, had ever actually met a human being. He hadn't understood, at the time, why that detail mattered enough for anyone to mention it. He was about to. A hull shuddered under a direct hit. Somewhere below, a woman screamed and then didn't, and Thalvok made himself keep his eyes on the display instead of turning toward the sound. Because turning wouldn't help her, and the display might still help someone else. Shields at reduced integrity across the formation, his tactical officer reported, a younger Olraki named Sess who had been a cartographer before the war, and still drew maps in the margins of his reports out of habit. Ship 9 has lost propulsion. Ship 4 is venting atmosphere. Get them evacuated to the archive's lower decks. There's no room, Commander. Make room. Thalvok had said that phrase so many times in the last 3 years that it had stopped meaning anything except survive a little longer. He did not know what it would mean this time. He only knew that 11 ships could not hold a line against 83 for much longer, and that when the line broke, it would break all at once. Admiral Zarvok watched the Olraki line collapse from the observation deck of the Eternal, and he touched the scar across his left eye the way he always did before he let himself feel satisfied. 8 campaigns, 4 worlds taken before this one. Each conquest logged and cross-referenced in a tactical archive. He trusted more than he trusted most of his own officers. He had never lost, and he had stopped expecting to, the way a man stops expecting rain after a decade in a desert. They are not answering their own distress call, his tactical officer reported, a broad-shouldered Vorathi named Kessa, who had served under Zarvok for 2 campaigns and had learned, in that time, exactly how much silence her commander preferred before delivering bad news. No response from any council world. They never do, Zarvok said. He studied the dying Olraki fleet a moment longer, the way a man studies a meal he has already decided to eat and is simply choosing where to begin. The council likes to watch, it does not like to bleed. He turned from the viewport, his bronze scales darkening faintly along his jaw. A tell his officers had learned to read as the closest thing to pleasure he showed in open engagement. Finish it. I want the last ship intact enough to carry the story home. Let them tell the next world what happens when the Dominion is patient enough to ask twice. Kessa hesitated. It was a small thing, a half-second longer than the acknowledgement usually took, but Zarvok noticed it, because noticing was a habit 8 campaigns had carved into him as deeply as the scar itself. Something troubles you. A signal left their formation 11 seconds ago. Encrypted. Long range. It wasn't addressed to any council relay we've catalogued. Zarvok considered this the way he considered most things that did not fit his existing database, with mild curiosity. Quickly discarded. Probably a personal transmission. A last message to a family member. Let them have it. It changes nothing. He touched the scar once more, a habit rather than a decision. Finish the fleet. Farron's voice cracked through the comm one final time, past the Vorathi jamming field that should have swallowed it whole, out into the dark, toward a listening post that had been waiting a very long time to hear exactly this. Titan relay station sat buried under 2 kilometers of methane ice, and it smelled the way old machinery always smells. Recycled air, warm metal, coffee gone cold in a mug nobody remembered pouring hours ago. The corridors ran narrow and low, lined with conduit that hummed faintly at a frequency most of the station's 42 personnel had long since stopped hearing. Admiral Hayes had been drinking that same cold coffee for 2 hours when the alert lit his console red. He didn't reach for a fresh cup. He'd learned, across a long career of quiet postings that occasionally stopped being quiet without warning, that the moment a red light appeared was not the moment to worry about coffee. Lieutenant Myra Chen didn't look up from her monitor at first. Chen tracked more channels than any one person should reasonably be able to hold in her head at once, and in 3 years at this post she had never once needed to say the word she was about to say. On the corner of her desk sat a small paper calendar, out of place among the glowing displays, and every day she hadn't said that word, she'd marked with a small check in blue ink. The checks ran back for months in a neat, unbroken column. The signal came through garbled, then clean, a voice alien desperate, counting down its own extinction in a language the station's translator caught half a second late, the words arriving just behind the panic in the tone that carried them. Chen's hand went still over the calendar. Confirm, Hayes said. Not a question. An order, delivered in the flat tone of a man who already suspected the answer and needed to hear it said aloud anyway. Confirmed. Olraki distress signal, civilian presence. Hostile force in pursuit. Chen's voice didn't waver, but her thumb pressed hard enough into the desk's edge to leave a faint mark in the composite surface. She pulled up the pattern classification, watched it resolve, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite dread. Pattern classification confirms genuine distress. Activate. Down in the engine bay, Petty Officer Draven had his hands buried in a coolant line when the ship's lighting shifted from amber to white. This is the first time I've said the word in 3 years. Then say it. Chen looked at her calendar one last time, at the long column of blue checks, and did not check today's box. And he felt the change before the alert even reached him. A low hum climbing up through the deck, plating like something waking from a very long sleep it hadn't quite expected to end. He had a daughter's name tattooed on the inside of his forearm and hadn't spoken her name out loud in 6 years, not since the transfer that put half a galaxy between them, but he talked to the engine like it was family, because in the way that mattered most to him. "There you are," he said to the hull, the way he always talked to it, like it could hear him and simply chose, most days, not to answer. At this point in his life, it was. He wiped coolant from his fingers and climbed the ladder toward the ready deck 2 levels up, where he found Captain Ilara Rourke already moving toward the ship, boots striking the deck plating with a rhythm too even to be anything but rehearsed. Rourke was 37 years old, 22 of those years spent waiting for a message exactly like this one. She'd run the scenario 1,247 times in simulation, and every one of those runs lived somewhere behind her eyes now, filed and cross-referenced and ready to be drawn on the instant she needed it. She'd trained for this the way some people train for a single race they intend to run only once, knowing that if the day ever actually came, there would be no second attempt. She stopped at the hatch of the Sentinel and touched the photograph tucked inside her collar, creased soft from years of handling, a man standing in a cockpit not unlike this one, smiling, like he already knew, somehow, that she'd be standing here someday. Her father had built this ship with his own hands, in a garage on a world she barely remembered, and had died 3 years before the caretaker protocol had ever needed to wake. She touched the photograph's corner the way she always did before a decision that mattered, and then she stepped through the hatch. Draven caught up to her at the ramp, still wiping coolant off his fingers onto a rag that had long since stopped doing any actual cleaning. "It's technically impossible, what you're about to ask her to do." "Technically impossible," Rourke said, settling into the pilot's seat, "is my favorite kind of possible." The ship's systems bloomed to life around her, not with a roar but with a quiet, patient certainty. "She's never actually done the micro-jump outside of simulation, you know. Not the real thing. Like something that had simply been waiting a long time to be asked. Displays lit in sequence. Restraints settled across her shoulders. Somewhere beneath her, the engine her father had designed began drawing power at a rate the specifications had never officially cleared for use outside of controlled testing. The message had reached 42 listening posts scattered across human-held space in the same handful of seconds. 39 dismissed it inside of 3 seconds, filed as noise, as nothing, as one more false alarm in a sector that produced them regularly. 3 held the line long enough to listen twice. One of those 3 was Titan. Behind Rourke, on a display that had sat dark for 300 years, dark since before her father was born, dark since before the Council had finished classifying humanity as primitive and moved on to more interesting species, a single word appeared, not an order, a name. Caretaker. She had heard stories about the protocol her whole career, told in the low voices officers use for things they've been ordered never to discuss in detail, and had never once seen it wake. Now the ship spoke to her directly, its voice level, almost gentle, the tone of something choosing its words with unusual care. Combat pattern recognized. Vorathi Dominion, 8 campaigns. 4 worlds taken a pause, brief and strange, the kind a person might take before saying something they'd waited a very long time to finally say aloud. "Please wait while I retrieve the appropriate counter-tactics." Rourke's hand found the edge of the photograph one more time. Outside the viewport, the ice-locked dark of Titan's surface gave way to the deeper dark beyond it, and somewhere past that dark, 11 ships and 2,300 people were running out of time she intended to give back to them. "Wake the system," she said. The ship did not answer with words this time. It answered by moving. Rourke watched the readouts climb, power curves she recognized from simulation, and beneath them, fainter, a set of tactical projections she'd never been shown before, calculations the ship was running on its own. The launch bay doors opened in absolute silence, the kind of silence that only exists in a vacuum, and the Sentinel slid free of Titan's ice shadow like something that had been holding its breath for 300 years and had finally been given a reason to let it out. Drawing from some deep archive she hadn't known existed until this exact moment. 300 years of watching. 300 years of listening to a galaxy that had written humanity off as primitive and never once bothered to check whether that assessment still held. She thought of her father's hands on this same console decades ago and wondered if even he had known exactly what he'd built. Distance to the void reach, she said. 4.2 light-years, the ship answered, and something in the way it said the number made it sound less like a fact and more like a countdown it had already started. Recommend micro-jump sequence, first activation outside simulated parameters. That's what he used to say too. The stars ahead smeared into lines of light, and then the lines folded in on themselves, and Titan Relay Station, and Chen's calendar, and Draven's daughter's name tattooed on skin, 6 years silent. Estimated margin of error, acceptable. Acceptable, Rourke repeated, and let herself almost smile. All fell away behind her into the dark she was about to cross in a fraction of the time anyone watching would believe possible. Ahead of her, though, she could not yet see it. 11 Uraki ships were down to 9. Thalvok felt the last archive buck under another impact and grabbed the console rail hard enough to bruise his palm. Sess's voice cut through the noise on the bridge, tight and fast. Ship 7 is gone, Commander. Ship 2 reports critical hull breach on 3 decks. Get their people moving into the archive. Where, Commander? We're already fine somewhere. Thalvok didn't shout it. He looked at the tactical display, at the red cluster of Varathi ships tightening around the remains of his formation like a hand closing slowly around something small, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that this might genuinely be the last hour of his life. He said it low, the way a man says a thing he no longer has the energy to argue about, only to insist on, and that he would spend it exactly like this, trying uselessly to find somewhere. Then Sess's voice changed, not louder. Different, Commander. Sensor contact. Single vessel. Approach vector. He stopped, checked the readout again, the way a person checks a number they don't quite believe the first time. Commander, that vector isn't possible. Nothing survives an approach at that angle. Thalvok looked up at the display, at the single small marker sliding onto the edge of the tactical grid, unarmed and unmarked and coming in fast. And for the first time in 3 years of retreat, he did not know what to feel. Nothing that small should have been moving that fast. Sess ran the numbers twice before he trusted them enough to speak again. Commander, the vector isn't decelerating. It's not headed toward the Varathi line at all. It's headed toward us. Thalvok watched the marker slide across the display, unarmed by every scan they could throw at it, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in 3 years of retreat. Not hope, exactly. Hope had gotten people killed before. This was closer to disbelief, the kind that makes a person stand very still and wait to be proven wrong. Identify it, he said. I can't. No transponder. No registered hull signature in the Council database. Sess's hands moved fast over his console, pulling every scrap of data the last archive's failing sensors could still gather. Wait, there's a broadcast. Weak. Repeating. The voice that came through the speakers was calm in a way that felt almost rude, given the circumstances. Earth Defense Command acknowledges distress signal. Estimated time to arrival, 90 seconds. Please hold position. Farron actually laughed, a short cracked sound with no humor in it at all. Hold position. As if we have anywhere else to go. Admiral Zarvok noticed the new contact 11 seconds after his tactical grid did, which was by his own standards, an unacceptable delay. He studied the single vessel, small, gray, unarmored by any reading his sensors could produce, and felt his interest curve sharply downward from the mild anticipation he'd carried a minute earlier. One ship, he said. No weapons signature. No shields. He almost laughed himself, the sound low and dry in his throat. Is this a ritual suicide? A distraction while the rest of them try to flee toward whatever remains of their border. Kessa didn't answer right away, which he'd learned meant she disagreed with him and was choosing her words carefully. It arrived at an approach vector our simulations classify as structurally impossible. The hull should have torn apart at that angle, and yet it didn't. Zarvok waved a hand, dismissing the point the way he dismissed most things that failed to fit cleanly into 8 campaigns of accumulated certainty. A design flaw in our simulations, then. Humans are not known for elegant engineering. Hold the line. Let it approach. I'd like to see what they intended to accomplish with one ship before we finish this. He touched the scar over his eye, a habit more than a decision, and settled back to watch. Rourke felt the ship shudder as it dropped out of the final micro-jump, and for half a second the universe reassembled itself around her in a rush of returning starlight and tactical data. The void reach spread out ahead, a graveyard of drifting debris from 3 older wars, and in the middle of it, the wreckage of a battle still very much in progress. 11 Oraki ships, though her display corrected that number almost immediately. 9 now. 83 Varathi hulls arranged in a loose, confident formation that had clearly stopped expecting resistance some time ago. Tactical assessment, she said. Varathi Dominion flagship Eternal, 12 cruisers, 70 support vessels. Combat pattern consistent with previous engagements. The ship's voice carried that same strange, careful pause it had used back at Titan. Recommend non-lethal disablement protocol. Confidence. Hi, you've done this before, Rourke said. It wasn't quite a question. Not this exact engagement, but the pattern is familiar. Another pause, and this time something in the ship's tone shifted, just slightly, towards something almost like satisfaction. Then let's be useful. The ship's engines shifted pitch, and she felt the first micro-jump take hold, not the long crossing she'd made to get here, but something smaller, tighter. I have been waiting 300 years to be useful again. Rourke's hand found the photograph one more time, just the corner of it, just enough to feel the worn edge under her thumb. A series of jumps that ate distance in increments too small for any weapon locked onto a straight-line trajectory to track. Zarvok watched the human ship begin to move and felt, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, a flicker of something he did not immediately recognize as unease. It did not move like a ship under conventional thrust. It flickered, there, then 800 meters closer, then gone again, then reappearing at an angle no propulsion system in his tactical archive could account for. His railgun crews tracked it on instinct, fired on the position it had occupied a half-second ago, and hit nothing but empty space. Fire pattern, he ordered. All batteries, saturate the approach corridor. 12 shots went out, all 12 missed. Again, 8 more. All 8 missed. Kessa's voice, when she reported it, had gone flat in a way Zarvok recognized from officers trying very hard not to let fear color their words. It's not evading randomly, sir. It's moving to positions our targeting solutions haven't calculated yet. She stopped herself. Finish the sentence. It's already somewhere else before we know where it's going to be. Zarvok touched his scar and said nothing for a long moment. 8 campaigns, 4 worlds, 3,012 tactical engagements cataloged in a database he had trusted absolutely, right up until this exact minute. Thalvok watched the small gray ship weave through his enemy's formation like something threading a needle at a speed no needle should allow, and beside him Sess made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob. It's not shooting back, Sess said. High Priestess Thessakel had spent 427 days recording this war from whatever vantage point the retreat allowed her, and something about this moment told her with a certainty she didn't fully understand yet. Why isn't it shooting back? Maybe it doesn't need to. On the last archive's cracked bridge, in the brief window of calm the human ship's arrival had bought them, a woman pushed through the crowded corridor toward the observation deck. That she needed to be watching when it happened. Whatever it turned out to be, she raised her recorder, pressed her thumb to the worn symbol, and began. And into the space where our allies should have been, one unmarked human vessel has arrived instead. Below her, through the viewport, the small gray ship flickered again, and this time when it reappeared. The Oraki fleet numbered 30 ships 4 years ago, she said quietly. For the record, for whoever would eventually hear this, it numbers 9 tonight. Something changed in the quality of the silence around it. The ship had stopped moving to avoid fire and started moving to answer it. The data stream hit every Varati system within 6,000 kilometers at once, and it didn't arrive as an attack, it arrived as a message. Please wait while I retrieve the appropriate counter-tactics. Zarvok's tactical officer went pale at the readout scrolling across her console. Not weapons fire, not a virus. Combat pattern recognized. Varathi Dominion, 8 campaigns. 4 worlds taken, but something worse in its own way, an itemized accounting of every engagement his fleet had ever fought, cross-referenced and analyzed in the space of a single breath. It's cataloging us, Kessa said, the way we'd catalog an enemy. We are not the enemy here. Zarvok snapped, though even as he said it, some small, unfamiliar part of him understood how the sentence sounded. We are the superior force. It came as a single round fired from a distance that should have made accuracy impossible, and it landed exactly where it needed to land, the forward battery housing, the one weapon platform capable of a killing shot at range. We have always been the superior force. The first precision shot took out the Eternal's forward cannon before he finished the thought. It didn't come as a barrage, gone in a flash of superheated plasma venting into vacuum. The third grazed close enough to the command deck's observation ring to scorch the hull paint along its length, close enough that every officer on the bridge flinched at once, and then it kept going, past the one place a killing shot belonged. "Return fire," Zarvok ordered, and heard for the first time something almost like uncertainty in his own voice. The second shot took the Eternal's primary thrusters out into open space where it did nothing at all except prove a point. Zarvok stared at the scorch mark spreading across his own viewport and understood, in a way his 8 campaigns had never prepared him to understand anything, that the miss had not been an error. Around the drifting battlefield, ship after ship went dark, not destroyed, disabled, engines and weapon systems failing in sequence too precise to be anything but deliberate. A cruiser's shields collapsed and stayed collapsed. A support vessel's navigation array shorted out and refused every attempt at reboot. 72 ships, in the span of minutes, folded into the same helpless silence, one after another, like a hand closing a series of doors it had no intention of ever opening again. 4 ships, panicking, turned their own weapons on each other in the confusion and destroyed themselves without the human ship firing a shot in their direction at all. 7 broke formation and fled into slipspace, engines straining past every safety threshold their captains had ever been trained to respect. Not one Vorathi life had been taken by a human weapon. Zarvok understood that too, and found that understanding it did nothing to make it easier to accept. On the last Archives bridge, Thelvok watched the tactical display resolve into something he hadn't seen in 3 years, a battlefield that was no longer trying to kill him. "Status," he said, and his voice for once didn't crack at all. "Vorathi fleet combat capability reduced by." Sess stopped, recalculated, stared at the number like it might change if he looked at it long enough. "Reduced to almost nothing, Commander. 72 ships disabled. 4 gone. 7 fled." He looked up. "We're not being fired on anymore." Farron's hands finally stopped moving across his console. He sat very still for a moment. The way a person sits still after running for a very long time and suddenly, finding there's nowhere left to run to. 2,300 people, he said quietly, mostly to himself. "We might actually get to keep them." Thessakel, still recording from the observation deck, watched the small gray ship come to rest at the center of the wreckage it had made, weapons silent, and lowered her recorder for the first time since she'd raised it. She had recorded 427 days of ships dying. She did not yet have words for what she had just watched instead, and something told her she would need to find them soon. Aboard the Sentinel, Rourke watched the tactical display settle into green across the board and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the first micro-jump. "Casualties," she said. "None inflicted by this vessel," the ship answered. "Recommend broadcasting evacuation authorization to all surviving Ulraki ships. Do it." The message went out on every open channel the ship could reach, her own voice recorded and layered under it, calm and level. Vorathi self-inflicted losses. 4 vessels. Ulraki losses during the engagement window. 2 vessels prior to arrival. A pause, the way she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in simulations that had never once felt this real. "The caretaker protocol has been activated. Earth Defense Command acknowledges the Ulraki distress call. Civilian evacuation is in progress. All hostile forces are advised to stand down. This is a rescue operation, not a military engagement." She hesitated for just a moment before the last line, then said it anyway, because it was true, and because some part of her father's hands had built this ship for exactly this purpose. Kessa watched him not say anything for a long time, longer than she'd ever seen him go without an order, and understood without needing to be told. "Please do not make us change our minds." On the Eternal's bridge, Admiral Zarvok heard those words arrive through a still-functioning comm relay and said nothing at all. That something fundamental had just come apart in the certainty her commander had carried through 8 campaigns and 4 conquered worlds. Now this, a fleet reduced to driftwood, a message broadcast to a galaxy that had spent 300 years calling humanity primitive, and somewhere behind all of it, He touched the scar over his eye, and for the first time in longer than Kessa had served under him, the gesture didn't look like satisfaction. It looked like a man checking whether an old wound still hurt the way he remembered. 90 seconds, then 11 minutes. A woman with a recording device who was only just beginning to understand what she'd need to say when someone finally asked her to explain it. No screaming, no cannon fire, no countdown left to hear. Thalvok stood at the center of a bridge gone suddenly, strangely quiet, and found the silence almost harder to process than the noise had been. Cess. Full count. I need to know who we still have. Cess was already moving, hands flying across a console that had spent 3 years delivering nothing but bad news. Working on it, Commander. Ships 2 and 7 confirmed lost before the human vessel arrived. Everyone else, he stopped, checked the number twice, the way a person checks something they're afraid to believe. Everyone else is still with us. All of them? Farron let out a breath that turned into something closer to a laugh, cracked and disbelieving. 2,300 people, he said again, quieter this time, like saying it too loudly might undo it. We get to keep almost all of them. Thalvok didn't answer right away. He was watching the tactical display where the small gray ship held position at the center of the wreckage it had made, and thinking that 3 years of retreat had never once prepared him for what it would feel like to stop retreating. Open a channel to the human vessel, he said. Coordinate evacuation transfers. Get our people onto the ships that still have working life support. Aboard the Sentinel. Rourke watched the transfer requests come in and felt something in her chest ease for the first time since the launch bay doors had opened on Titan. She reached for the water bottle clipped beside her seat, drank without really tasting it, and let herself sit still for exactly as long as it took to swallow. Ship status, she said. Structural integrity nominal. Weapon systems cooling. No damage sustained. A pause. Captain, there is a data log in the archive you have not yet accessed. It predates my activation by several years. Your father's designation is attached to it. Rourke's hand found the photograph without quite meaning to move it there. Play it. Her father's voice filled the cockpit, older than she remembered it, tired in a way she'd never heard from him in person. If you're hearing this, the protocol finally woke up for something worth waking up for. I built the miss into the targeting logic myself. Not a failsafe. A choice. I wanted whoever flew this ship to understand. The whole point was never to be able to kill. It was to be able to stop and choose not to go further. That's the harder thing to build. I hope you never have to use it. I hope more that if you do, you remember why it's there. The recording ended. Rourke sat with it a moment, the water bottle still in her hand, and understood, with a clarity that settled somewhere deep and permanent, that the deliberate miss at Zarvok's command deck hadn't been a tactic she'd chosen in the moment. It had been built into the ship before she was old enough to walk. Log it, she said finally. Continue coordinating the evacuation. On the Eternal's bridge, Admiral Zarvok had not moved from the observation deck in several minutes, and Kessa had learned, over 2 campaigns of service, exactly how dangerous that particular stillness could be. Orders, sir, she said, because someone needed to say something, and none of the other officers were willing to be the one. Zarvok didn't turn from the viewport. Below them, 72 of his ships drifted dark, and beyond them, the small human vessel sat motionless, weapons silent, having already made its point. Casualties, he said. None inflicted by the human ship. 4 vessels lost to our own systems failing under stress. No Vorathi lives taken directly. Kessa hesitated, then said the rest of it anyway, because he needed to hear it from someone. The ship is gone. The formation is gone. The certainty is gone. Zarvok finally turned. The scar across his eye looked, in the low light of the bridge, less like a mark of 8 campaigns and more like a question he'd never had to ask himself before. Prepare the fleet for withdrawal. Whatever ships still have functioning engines, and the 7 that fled into slipspace. Let them go. They'll tell the story before we do. He looked back out at the wreckage a moment longer. I have fought 8 campaigns and taken 4 worlds, and I have never once needed to understand an enemy who refused to fight the way I expected. I am beginning to think that was never a strength. I think it was simply a war I hadn't lost yet. He said nothing else. Kessa relayed the withdrawal order and did not ask him to elaborate. 400 light-years away, in a chamber that had stood for 9,000 years, without once needing to interrupt its own proceedings, the Galactic Council received the broadcast in real time. The footage played across the central display without commentary. The wreckage, the silence, the human ship's voice repeating its stand-down order to a fleet that no longer had the capacity to disobey it. 4,200 representatives watched a battle end without a single Varathi death, and for a long moment, none of them spoke. Then one did. Councillor Amarith Vess had voted, 3 years ago, among the 12 who'd argued for intervention. She had said little since, in a body that rewarded patience and punished dissent, and her colleagues had mostly stopped expecting her to say anything at all. She rose now, in a chamber built to seat 4,000 and silence very nearly all of them, and her voice carried without needing to be raised. "We were told they were primitive," she said. "We were told their silence meant they had nothing worth offering this council. I would like the record to show that the silence was never absence. We simply never asked the right question. No one answered her." The footage kept playing. The small gray ship holding its position at the center of a fleet it had chosen not to destroy, and the chamber's 9,000-year quiet took on a different weight than it had carried an hour earlier.
Word reached Thalvok's bridge within minutes, a formal request, relayed through channels that had ignored the Ulraki for 3 years and now, suddenly could not move fast enough. The council wished to hear testimony.
Specifically, they wished to hear from whoever had recorded the engagement firsthand. Thalvok found Thessakel on the observation deck, recorder still in hand, watching the evacuation ships begin their slow crossing toward the Sentinel's escort formation. "They want you," he said. "The council? They want to hear what you saw." Thessakel looked down at the recorder, at the symbol worn smooth by 427 days of use, and did not answer right away. "Tell them I'll need a moment first." She pressed her thumb against the worn symbol, and for the first time since the wreckage had gone quiet, began to speak into the recorder. Not for the archive this time. She had spent all that time recording a war she'd expected no one to ever ask her about. Now the asking had come, and she found she wasn't certain yet what she would say when it did. "Tell them I'll speak," she said finally. But for the words she would need when the council finally asked her to explain what patience had cost and what it had bought. The conclave's spire had not fallen silent in 9,000 years. It fell silent now. Thessakel stood at the center of a chamber built to hold 4,200 representatives, small beneath a ceiling that curved away into shadow, her recorder held in both hands the way a person holds something they are afraid to drop. Before she spoke, she did the thing she had done every day for 427 days. She pressed her thumb to the worn symbol on the device's corner, checked that it was recording, and set it down on the podium in front of her without looking at it again. It was such a small, ordinary motion that half the chamber didn't notice her do it at all. "I did not come here to tell you what happened," she said. "You have already watched the footage. You know the ship count. You know the casualties." She paused, and in that pause, 4,000 representatives who had spent 9,000 years rewarding patience and punishing dissent waited, for the first time and longer than most of them could remember, to hear what a single witness had to say. "I came here to tell you what it meant." She let her hands rest flat on the podium. They were never asking for permission. They were waiting for the right question. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You classified them as primitive 300 years ago and never once revisited the classification. You mistook their silence for absence. It was preparation. It was patience, and patience, as you have now learned, is a weapon you cannot see until it is already inside your defenses." Councillor Vess, seated in the front tier, did not move. Around her, representative after representative sat with the particular stillness of people confronting a mistake too large to argue their way out of. "They did not send a fleet," Thessakel said. "They sent one ship. One ship that did not kill a single soul, that stopped an admiral with 8 campaigns and 4 conquered worlds behind him without firing a shot he couldn't have taken back. They did not send an army. They sent a question. And the question was, are you sure you want to know what we are capable of?" No one answered her. No one in that chamber, in 9,000 years, had ever needed to sit with a silence quite like this one. Word of the council's reaction reached Titan Relay Station before Rourke's ship had even finished its return crossing. Admiral Hayes read the summary twice, set down a coffee that had finally gone cold for the last time that day, and looked at Chen, whose calendar still sat on the corner of her desk, its long column of checkmarks ending, at last, on a day that hadn't needed one. "Final numbers on the evacuation," Hayes said. Chen didn't need to look it up. She'd been tracking it since the first transfer ship crossed. "Most of the civilians made it," she said quietly. Not all of them. Every one of them. Down in the last archive's cargo hold. Thalvok sat with a data slate and a list that grew longer every hour as survivors were counted and confirmed, and beside each name he wrote nothing at all, just the name. Some were already gone before the Sentinel arrived. She didn't reach for a specific count. It didn't feel like something that belonged in a number anymore. Commander Thalvok is compiling the names himself, and the fact that someone had lived long enough to be written down. He thought of the aide who'd told him, years ago, that only 12 representatives had ever met a human being, and he wondered, writing name after name, whether any of the other 387 understood yet what that ignorance had nearly cost. Aboard the Sentinel, Rourke guided the ship back toward Titan's ice-locked dark and let her hand rest one last time on the photograph tucked inside her collar. Status of the Verati withdrawal, she said. Admiral Zarvok's remaining fleet has departed the Void Reach. No further hostile action detected. A pause, and this time the ship's voice carried something almost gentle in it. Your father would have been proud of the restraint you showed. Rourke didn't answer right away. She thought of the recording, his tired voice, the miss built into the targeting logic before she was old enough to walk, the whole quiet architecture of a weapon designed never to need to be won. He built it so I wouldn't have to choose, she said finally. I think that was the point all along. Not the ship, the choosing not to. She touched the photograph's worn corner one last time and let it go. On the flagship that no longer commanded a fleet worth the name, Admiral Zarvok stood alone on an observation deck and did not touch the scar over his eye. Kessa found him there, hours later, and delivered the report he'd asked for without softening it. Command has recalled us. There will be a formal review of the engagement. Let them review it. Zarvok didn't turn from the dark outside the viewport. 8 campaigns taught me how to win against an enemy who fights the way I expect them to. It taught me nothing about a species that would rather stop me than kill me. I do not know what that costs me yet. I suspect I will spend a long time finding out. He said nothing else, and Kessa did not ask him to. 6 months later, on a world that had begun slowly to feel less like a permanent camp and more like something that might one day be called home again, High Priestess Thessakel stood at the edge of a resettlement that housed what remained of her people. Thalvok found her there, watching the sun go down over buildings still half-framed in scaffolding. The Council has opened formal contact channels with Earth, he said. Vess is leading the delegation. Good. Thessakel didn't look away from the horizon. 9,000 years is a long time to unlearn. She held her recorder loosely in one hand, the way she'd carried it every day since the wreckage had gone quiet. It's a start, at least. And looked down at it. The symbol on its corner worn smooth now, not just from 427 days of war, but from every day since, every testimony she'd given, every survivor's account she'd gathered, so the record would hold more than just her own voice. She pressed her thumb to the symbol once, out of habit, and did not speak into it this time. She simply held it and watched the light change over a world that was slowly learning how to stand again.